Hi, I'm Mili Avital, and I'm reading The Road of No Return by Rachel Haring Korn. By morning, the whole city had heard about the new edict. But in Hirschlaser Sokol's household, everyone pretended they knew nothing. And just like on any other day, Bela lit the stove and began to cook the family's ghetto portion of grits and half-rotten potatoes. And just like on any other day, she set the table with 7 plates and 7 spoons laid out in a double row. The double row was to ward off the evil spirits lurking outside. Every few minutes she ran to the door and with a corner of her apron, wiped the steam from its glass window pane and looked down to the street. On that autumn day of 1942, there wasn't a Jew to be seen in that Galician village, except for a Jewish policeman with a bundle of documents under his arm who would pass by and disappear in the street that led to the office of the Judenrat. Father hasn't come back yet, Bela muttered, more to herself than to the others. Her aged mother-in-law was sitting near the kitchen sorting plucked feathers into a patched bag, turned and asked, "What that you're saying, Bela?" "Nothing, Schwinger." All at once, there was a commotion in the corner where the 2 youngest children were playing. Dovidel was pulling a doll out of Sorke's hands and waving a stick at her. "When I order you to hand over the baby, you must obey. Otherwise, I'll take you away too, and you'll be beaten into the bargain." Bela ran over to the children. "What's all this uproar about? What's going on here?" "Mother, he's hitting me," Sorka burst out. "Let go of her this minute," Bela ordered. But 8-year-old Dovidel wouldn't let go and kept on tugging at his sister's doll. "We're playing the game of cursing, and in cursing, there's no mother around. In this game, you must obey the police. If she won't hand over her baby, then both she and the baby will have to go. See, here's my rifle." He pointed at a stick. "Phew, may your games smolder and smolder in some wretched wilderness. Throw away the stick this instant and come here. Some game you invented for yourselves." "But mother, you saw what happened to our neighbor Malka and to Shmerka Yosef's son? The police took her away along with her child. Don't you remember?" "In my house, I won't allow such games. You hear? Such a big boy and he understands nothing. Go to your brother Lippe." Whenever Bela couldn't handle Dovidel, she would turn him over to her eldest son. Lippe was the only one Dovidel would listen to. Lippe was sitting at the table in the next room, writing. He neither fumed around nor uttered a single word. His mother came in and stood at his back, waiting for him to help her rein her unruly young one. Dovidel, too, was waiting. He had become suddenly quiet and was staring eagerly at his older brother. The pen in Lippe's hand moved quickly across the blank paper, as if it were hurrying towards some inevitable goal where Lippe was only an accessory and the instrument of someone else's will. Bela's ears, always alert to the smallest sound, now heard an odd rustling like the swish of silk. Turning toward the sound, she saw the open wardrobe, and between its doors, her daughter Muriel taking out her dresses and trying them on one by one in front of the mirror. "What bleak holiday are you celebrating today?" "Oh, mother, I just felt like trying on my dresses." Bela gave her a searching glance as if she were some newly arrived stranger. For the last 2 years, living with constant anxiety and fear, she had begun to think of her children as a precious charge she must protect from all outside threat and danger. In that same instant, she recognized that Muriel, her 14-year-old daughter, had suddenly grown up and ripened into a young woman. Muriel's thin, childish shoulders were now softly curved, as if waiting to take on the burden of a new and mysterious longings. Her brown gazelle's eyes were filled with a womanly acceptance of faith. And as if she owed this burgeoning daughter something she could never repay, Bela, like a bankrupt debtor, sat down and gave herself up to a wail of grief. Her bottled up fear and dread of the unavoidable future now found its way through some obscure channel inside her, releasing a storm of tears. Bela began to rock to and fro, her head in her arms, sobbing all the while as if her breasts were being torn to pieces inside her. The two children tiptoed into the kitchen and began to nose around like two kittens among the pots and pans. Sorka returned and pulled Meryl away from the clothes cupboard. Come, let's stick a fork into the potatoes and see if they're done. Dovidal ran to the door. I'm going outside to find out what's taking father so long. Bela was startled out of her trance. Don't dare step out of this house. Do you want to cause, God forbid, a catastrophe? The dragging sound of feet was now heard on the stairs, climbing each stair slowly, one at a time. Lipe folded his writing in his breast pocket and ran to open the outside door, which had been kept locked and bolted since the arrival of the Germans. Father and son confronted each other. The son's eyes were full of questions, demanding to know what the father had learned and what, for the time being, would have to be kept hidden from the other. The father bowed his head as if he himself were guilty for what was now happening, guilty of having taken a wife and for having brought children into the world, a wife and children he could no longer protect. It took only one look at her husband for Bela to realize there was no point in asking him anything. The lines in Hirschlaser's face had grown deeper. They were etched in grayness, as if they had absorbed all the dust and debris of the street. His nose seemed to have grown longer and was as sharp as that of a corpse, while his usually neat and tidy dark beard was unkempt and disheveled. Will you wash your hands now, Hirschlaser? Yes, at once, and we'll sit down to eat. They ate in silence. No one paid attention to what and how much each spoonful held. They swallowed their food half chewed. Even the children, already used to uncertainty and fear, felt a disaster was about to happen, but dared not to ask what. Something ominous was in the air. Whenever a spoon accidentally struck the edge of a plate and made it ring, they were all startled and looked reproachfully away. All of them. Only the grandmother concentrated on her food as she brought each spoonful to her toothless gums. The first to rise from the table was Hirschlaser. Wiping his mustache with the back of his hand, he began to pace back and forth with maddening regularity. When Bela started to clear the table, he signaled her, "Don't bother, Bela." She let her hands fall. They'd suddenly become too heavy, and she stood in front of her husband, blocking his way and trying to stop him from pacing the room. Have you heard anything more? Is it true what people are saying? True, all true, Bela. His husband's voice sounded hoarse and muffled, as if a thorn were stuck in his throat. Placards were posted everywhere, on all the buildings and fences. Every family must send one of its members within 2 hours. Do you realize what that means? Each family must choose its own victim. One of us must go, otherwise all of us will be taken, all of us without exception. And, he added ironically, the Germans are allowing us free choice. They were all stunned, but no one was surprised you could expect anything from the Germans. Each one studied the other. Who would go to the place from which there is no return? Abruptly, a wave of estrangement overwhelmed them. Each one would already see the victim in the other. Each one felt the enmity of the others. Who would be chosen and who would do the choosing? With what measure should they be measured? On what scales should they be weighed in order to decide who must die now and who deserved to stay alive, at least for now? In that case, Lipe spoke with unusual calm without looking at the bowed heads. In that case, and he stopped in mid-sentence, as if the weight of his just now uttered words were too heavy for their quaking limbs to bear. In that case, all of them sat down. They all tried to find the lowest, most insignificant chair, as if they intended to sit Shiva for their own inner selves. Bela seized the two youngest, as if she could hide them in her own two hands or build walls around them which no enemy could breach. The grown-ups had begun to calculate the years each had already lived and the years still promised. They added up the lines in every face and counted the gnarled veins on the back of every hand. The father mustn't go, that was clear. He was the provider, the breadwinner. And the mother, definitely not. What would become of the children without her? As Felipe, what had he tasted of life in his 24 years, the last two darkened by the German occupation? Let him consider carefully. Maybe he should quickly steal away and be done with it. His mother would wail and tear her hair. His father would agonize while saying Kaddish, and Dovidel would miss him day and night without understanding why his Lippe had disappeared. But at first, they would all breathe easier because he would have released them from the need to mourn their own lost souls. In his mind, Lippe was already bidding them all adieu. Tomorrow, he'd be gone. Everything would remain just as it was, except he'd no longer be among them. He'd no longer see the sun, the sky, or the old clock on the bureau. He touched his breast pocket and removed his watch and the money he kept there, and unobserved pushed them underneath the big clock, folding a few banknotes into the pages that he'd been writing. It was a letter to Elka, his last letter. He would have to find a Polish messenger, since it was forbidden to receive letters from the ghetto. Elka was living on the other side as a Pole with false Aryan papers, and she'd recently let him know that she was preparing similar papers for him, complete with seals and signatures. Together, they'd go to one of the big cities where it would be easier to hide and lose themselves in the Polish crowds. Was there anyone who should go in his place? What about the grandmother, his old booby? As Lippe's glance searched for the grandmother, it met his parents' eyes. They'd already added up her years, years that had fallen as gradually as leaves from a tree in autumn, leaving its trunk naked and vulnerable. But no one dared to utter such thoughts. Aloud. No one dared to say go, or to become the judge of her last few rugged years. As their eyes ate into her, the old lady began to droop and hunker down into her chair as if she would have liked to dissolve and become part of the chair. She wanted to become so rooted in the bit of ground under her that no one would ever be able to dig her out. In that moment, the senses of the others became suddenly keener and more sensitive. Each one's thoughts lay open to the others in these moments of heightened perception. Only the grandmother's thoughts remained close to them, as close as her half-blind, extinguished eyes. She had sealed all the avenues to her innermost self in order to ward off the prelude to death. She suddenly felt isolated in the circle of her family. Beside the son she'd given birth to and cared for, beside her own flesh and blood, even her son's eyes sought her out and pointed to her. And because of it, she would resist with all her strength of her being. There was no one to take her part, no one to give her a loving look across the wall of separation. When you know you will be missed, it is easier to die. They imagine it's less difficult for old people to die. Maybe so, but only if death comes in its proper time and place, in your own bed. But to go forth and meet death willingly, carrying your bundle of worn out bones. Quietly, hold everything. She's not ready yet. She still has to go back over her life. She still has to remember it once more from the beginning, starting with the time she was a child in her mother's house. She too had been a child, just like her son and grandchildren. She too sat on her mother's lap, just like Sorke and Bela's. Mother, mother, she murmured through blue lips, as if she would call her back from the world of the dead. Mother. She called, just as she used to call her in her childhood when she was afraid of being spanked. She had almost forgotten what her mother looked like. Her features had faded and were rusted with time. 2 big tears rolled from her closed eyes and fell into the net of wrinkles covering her face. And later she pictured herself as a bride. She'd only seen her bridegroom, David, once at the time of the betrothal. Even then, all her dreams were centered on him. When they began preparing her wedding clothes, she'd insisted on the best of everything, on the most costly materials. She chose an iridescent blue silk shot through with roses woven into cloth. She'd wanted to please her bridegroom. Her wedding dress had hung in the cupboard until recently. She hadn't let anyone touch it. It was only during the last few months that she'd let them make it over for Meryl, because Meryl looked like her. When she looks at Meryl, she sees herself as a girl. The clock struck once and then twice. Everyone suddenly came to life. Soon, until now they'd all be waiting for something to happen, some miracle, and now there was less than an hour left. Meryl drew herself up to her full height. She whipped her coat off its hanger and stood in the middle of the room. I'm leaving. All heads turned. She stood there in the made-over iridescent silk dress she had forgotten to take off when her mother scolded her for trying it on. Or perhaps she just enjoyed wearing it. Whether the dress made her look older and more grown up, or whether it was the stubborn expression on her face, it seemed to everyone that Meryl had grown taller in the past few hours. Where? What kind of going? This from her father, with his red-rimmed, bloodshot eyes. You know very well where. Goodbye, everybody. And she was at the door. With a single leap, her father was beside her, holding her sleeve. Get back this minute. If you don't, there'll be trouble. You hear? As Meryl struggled with her father, there was a sharp whistling noise as the ancient silk of her sleeves split and tore. Everyone looked on, but no one moved, neither to stop her father nor to help Meryl. With one hand, Hirsch Laser was holding Meryl. With the other hand, he was undoing his belt. No one understood what was happening. Was their father intending to beat Meryl now of all times? His favorite child against whom he'd never before raised a hand? The one for whom he always bought special gifts for her rather than the two youngest? It could only be due to the confusion and turmoil they all felt, kind they had suppressed with all their might. Now it had grown and festered in their father like a boil that ripens and finally bursts. At last, he had the belt in his hand and was twirling it above Meryl like a lasso. He lowered it over her shoulders and then slid it down to her waist and tightened it as if she were a shock of wheat in a field. He tested the belt several times to see if it was tight enough. Only then did he grasp the loose end and, dragging Meryl like a trussed up calf, he led her to the table and fastened the belt to the table's leg post. Tying the knot at the other end, he pulled the belt through the buckle with his teeth, and then he wiped his forehead and sat down with his hands on his knees and drew a few harsh, choppy breaths. Meryl was on her knees, leaning against the table leg where her father had left her. She was motionless, completely drained by the scene of the last few minutes. For the first time in her young life, she had aspired to do something brave. Let it be death, so what? She had gone forth to meet it, like a bride her bridegroom. From early morning, she had been preparing for this gesture, and now she had been shamed and humiliated, and her father, her darling father, who knew her better than anyone else, including her mother, was the one who'd shamed her. He wouldn't let her make her sacrifice. It was all very well, it seemed, for Isaac to be sacrificed, but not for her. And his father, Abraham, was himself the one who brought him. He had taken them by the hand, knowing full well what God demanded. And here all of them, yes, she saw it, she knew all of them wanted the grandmother to go. Did grandmother have the strength to drag herself to faraway places? And what was the sacrifice of an old person worth, since the old person would have to die soon anyway? For the first time in her life, Meryl felt a deep hatred for her father. She tried angrily to free herself so she could at least stand up, but she had forgotten about the belt, which now cut more and more into her body. She fell back and lay stretched out across the threshold, her head buried in her arms. A band of light from the window came to rest at her feet. As the light fell on her, the iridescent blue silk, interwoven with rose-colored flowers, shone with new life. The room had grown silent again, except for the buzzing of a single fly as it searched for a quiet spot to have its last wintry sleep. All heads were bowed. Let whatever was to happen, happen. Let the parting be dictated by some external force, by fate. And if all of them had to go instead of just one, then so be it. If God above willed it, if he could let it happen, they would have accepted gladly. Only the ticking of the clock divided the silence as its hands moved inexorably toward the appointed hour. Abruptly, the father turned. All eyes followed the direction of its glance. The grandmother's chair was empty. Everyone was so absorbed in his own thoughts that no one had noticed her going. Where had she gone? How did she leave the house so quietly that no one had heard her? Not one of them had heard her. It must have happened only a few minutes ago. Everyone's eyes now searched the corners of the room. Suddenly, a shadow appeared in the glass pane of the door that led to the vestibule. As the shadow came closer, it gradually filled the entire window. All eyes followed it. Yes, it was the grandmother in her old black cape, the one she wore on holidays. Under one arm, she carried a small pouch with her prayer book, while with the other arm, she slowly unfastened the chain on the outer door. Soon the door closed and swung back on its hinges. None of them left their places. None of them called her back. All remained seated, frozen into place. Only their heads moved and bowed lower and lower, as if their rightful place lay there at their feet, with the dirt and dust of the threshold.